These animals will be extinct in your lifetime. Lions' population has dropped over 90% in the last 100 years. Their biggest threat is humans taking away their land. Polar bears only have 22,000 left in the wild, with their numbers rapidly dropping as the Earth's temperature rises and their home starts melting. The cross-river gorilla is the rarest gorilla in the world, only found in small parts of Nigeria and Cameroon, and an animal gone as soon as 2025, with only 250 left in the wild.
In a leaked memo, General Michael Minahan says that open conflict between America and China could happen as early as 2025.
In 2025, the Earth may be hit with a solar storm so extreme that it would be harder for us to recover from than the top 10 natural disasters combined.
At a top robotics company in Japan this week, 4 robots being developed for military applications killed 29 humans in the lab. And they did it by shooting what he called metal bullets. The scariest part is that lab workers deactivated 2 of the robots, took apart the 3rd. But the 4th robot began restoring itself and somehow connected to an orbiting satellite to download information about how to rebuild itself even more strongly than before.
Mark my words, AI is far more dangerous than nukes. Far.
You can get creative with a novel, a TV show, or a movie, but history books, that's not supposed to be fan fiction. How we teach our kids history has become a big controversy these days, with liberals accusing conservatives of wanting to whitewash the past, and sometimes that's true. Sometimes they do. But plenty of liberals also want to abuse history to control the present. And last month, a scholar named James Sweet caught hell for calling them out for doing just that. He criticized a phenomenon known as presentism, which means judging everyone in the past by the standards of the present. It's the belief that people who lived 100 or 500 or 1,000 years ago really should have known better. Which is so stupid. It's like getting mad at yourself for not knowing what you know now when you were 10. Stupid me, spending all that time raising sea monkeys and...
It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words. And today in our own world, we're seeing a very similar process unfold. You see, things as simple as children's books, I'm talking Roald Dahl books, are now being pushed through a demented purity filter, where all bad words or paragraphs are now being rewritten. Words like witches are being turned to hags, fat turned to ginormous, black person to dark, cloud men to cloud people. Entire sections of these children's books are being rewritten to eliminate any wrong thing. And this isn't just children's books. This is happening throughout all genres. Roald Dahl is just the most egregious example of this. But it doesn't even stop there, because even a recent UK government-backed report has now claimed that reading George Orwell's 1984 is a sign of, quote, extremism. So Western governments are now characterizing people who read 1984 as potential enemies of the state. And our society that we live in right now is just a few steps away from totalitarianism.
Speech used to be a left or liberal value, and yet we see from the in quotes left a desire to actually censor. I think we should be extremely concerned about anything that undermines the First Amendment. There's a reason for the First Amendment. People came from countries where they could not speak freely and where saying certain things would get you thrown into prison. And they were like, well, we don't want that here.
They came from a world that was oppressive, ruled by kings and queens and popes and prelates and bishops and lords and barons, who just because they didn't like the way you looked could chop you into quarters and throw you to the pigs if they wanted to, anytime they wanted to. And if you didn't believe the religion they wanted you to believe in, they'd burn you at the stake or torture you. In some way, make your life absolutely miserable. They came here to create a new world, free from all of that.
By the way, in many parts of the world, including parts of the world that people might think are relatively similar to the United States, the speech laws are draconian.
England is quite different.
I won't name any countries, but...
In France, I think if you deny the Holocaust, which I think is abhorrent, but I also think it should be part of free speech.
I really can't emphasize this enough. We must protect free speech. And free speech only matters, it's only relevant when it's someone you don't like saying something you don't like. The thing about censorship is that for those who would advocate it, just remember, at some point, that will be turned on you.
Imagine if you lived in a world where you were constantly watched. A world where everything is controlled by the elite, where you're bombarded with non-stop propaganda. A world where everyone is repressed, lonely and isolated, existing as one insignificant cog in an incomprehensible machine. This is the chilling vision of the future that George Orwell put forward in his masterpiece 1984. And does it sound familiar? It's no coincidence that his predictions have come true in nearly every single way in our modern society today. Like when the establishment media, politicians and World Economic Forum claim to be working for freedom and free speech, also while doing everything they can to bully and censor all criticism into silence. And there are just countless examples of this, like when the fattest, most grotesque politicians of them all claim that they're promoting health. And this concept has evolved over time as people realize that all of society's institutions are built upon a necessary fiction. And this is known as the habitus. It's the veil you need to see through for society to make sense. You see, throughout your life, you are influenced by your environment and your interactions with other people. And these combined with your personality create your view of the world. And it's in this way that you buy into the habitus, the shared societal illusion of how the world should be. You are socialized into the habitus. It's come down from above and everyone else around you believes in it. The habitus is the social contract between you, your fellow man, and the government. And it's what determines your culture. It's what determines all the societal trends around you, and therefore also decides the rules of society. And this stretches to everything. Our ideas of beauty, what's seen as valuable, what's seen as even right and wrong. But because it's influenced by the environment and how people treat each other, the habitus is always changing to reflect this.
I only have one question. Why do you want to put an axe wound in between your son's legs? You're openly advocating for pedophilia. You people are the symptom of a dying society.
You're scaring children. Shut the
We're
fuck
scaring
up.
children.
Shut the fuck
But not
up.
you. You are child abusers.
Not you.
And you're not a real woman. Your children should be home. Your kids aren't actually gay. You've just groomed them.
I don't know that I've ever exhibited phobia of trans people. I'm not afraid of trans people.
Well, transphobia is more along the lines of prejudice against the trans.
So I actually think that your first characterization was right. I think that transphobia is really disagreement with the basic principle that the trans community is trying to purvey, which is that people's sex is malleable, that people can move from male to female, and that it is my job, objectively, to now call them the name they wish to be called, and to teach my children that men can be women and women can be men. I fundamentally disagree with that point. Now, with that said, is everybody in the United States entitled to the same rights? Of course, but your right does not extend to forcing me to call you what you want me to call you. That's not the way this works. That violates my freedom of speech. So, in intrapersonal relationships, if I were out to dinner with a trans person, would I make a point of noting their proper biological sex? No, because that would be impolite.
This is what giving a 16-year-old girl testosterone looks like.
So I got out of my haircut because my hair was driving me nuts, and I shaved it because I'm tired of watching my hair thin out, and it's less distressing if I shave it. So when I talk about being too far gone, I don't really know what else to call it. This is what I mean. This is how deep my voice is. It's gotten deeper over time, and it's settled. This is what I mean by hair loss. And it just keeps getting worse. It keeps thinning. It keeps receding backwards. And I'm not exactly sure that's coming back. That's when I talk about, just kind of staying how I am, regardless of how I feel. That's why, just because I don't really see me personally being able to come back from what's happened so far.
There is no way to undo the damage inflicted on her body by the adults who mutilated her body.
So you were talking about Leah Thomas undressing in the locker room in front of other swimmers. And one of the things you said was someone should have taken care of it like in the 50s or 60s.
I did say that.
To me, it kind of sounds like an incitement of violence. Maybe that's not how you meant to say it.
In the 50s or 60s, the sheriff would have went in and arrested that pervert. It's not a call to violence. I don't support violence. people decided to lie about my words in the 50s or 60s, the men, the fathers of those daughters, wouldn't have been able to get there fast enough because the local DA would have already indicted that philandering person for exposing himself to women for his own egocentric narcissism, weird fetish to pretend he's something he's not.
This is happening all over the West. When anyone who speaks out against the agenda set in place by Western governments, they are then often censored or bullied into silence.
I'm that petrifying to these billion-dollar companies? Well, good. I hope I am. And I hope everybody else becomes that. I mean, this is what they're afraid of. They're afraid of one voice. Imagine.
Whether it be Julian Assange or Edward Snowden talking about the government's crimes, or any other supposed thought criminal who's been cancelled on social media for talking about COVID and its origins. Anything deemed a thought crime and you can be cancelled immediately. I mean, it's gotten to the point now where FBI and other government intelligence agencies are infiltrating and working in conjunction with all the big social media sites. And once they have control of sites like Twitter, they can then censor any narrative they don't like, shadow banning or completely deleting people from the sites. But it's not just social media companies. Now even companies like Uber, PayPal, and even Airbnb can ban you for having the wrong opinions online. And then over in China is their infamous social credit system. The basic idea is for each person to be assigned a personal score based on how trustworthy they are according to the Chinese government. Certain things can increase your score, like making a social media post praising the government. But on the other hand, things like getting into debt, buying too many video games, reading the Bible, or criticizing the government deducts points from your score. And if your score falls too low, the CCP will then severely reduce your already restricted freedoms, as people with a low score can have trouble buying train or even plane tickets. Some people have even had their pets taken away from them, with one student even being denied a place at university because his father had a low score. For now, the system is only being put into practice by some scattered regional governments, but it won't be that way for very long. And recently it's usually being pushed through new laws to lay the groundwork, meaning that a nationwide social credit system is just a few years away. I mean, recently it's gotten so bad in China that a new law just passed, which means that farmers can only plant the crops the government approves of, and the personal planting of vegetables like beans, melons, squashes, in your front or backyard is now strictly forbidden. And in the West, we're also seeing a gradual progression of repression, which is exactly what George Orwell feared.
I think anyone who hasn't experienced racism shouldn't say anything about it.
Okay, cool. So I grew up quite a while. 5 years in a black neighborhood. I got in a fight every other day for it because I had red hair. They called me Rooster. I literally got in fights every day.
So you got bullied. Ooh.
That's not racism.
Exactly.
Oh, it's not.
It's discrimination based on what he looks like.
That's exactly what racism is.
It's not racism. They didn't stop.
He wasn't oppressed. We were the ones that oppressed, so you can't call that racism.
In 2023, how are you oppressed? Because I got news for you, honey. If you had a skill set that was worth something to somebody, you would be the richest fucker in here.
Men don't want to be husbands. Women don't want to be wives. Men and women married to each other is a disaster because men are not good for women and women are not good to men. They're better off without each other.
Reasons or advantages to date a 31-year-old over a 21-year-old, for me personally.
So can you clarify what your advantages would be for dating a 21-year-old over a 31-year-old, since you're comparing the two?
Lower body count, less baggage, probably better able to pair bond. There's a few there. You got some, it sounded like you might have some.
No, like, I mean, so
oh,
like...
better looking.
That's a stretch. That's the thing. Everything you just said right there.
Bro, come on.
No, like what he's saying is true. What he's saying is true, but
it's so subjective, though.
No, like it's...
Podcaster Joe Rogan gave his take on the impending arrest of Donald Trump in last Wednesday's episode of The Joe Rogan Experience. Here he is chatting about it with MMA fighter and Trump supporter Jorge Masvidal. Let's watch.
They're talking about arresting him for paying a girl to stop talking about them having sex. I thought that was a good deal. I thought it's a good deal. You pay someone. Didn't Clinton do that? Didn't John Edwards got in trouble for doing that, but he didn't go to jail.
The one dude that's fighting for us, that's actually for the people, they want to crucify him.
But they just don't want him president again, and they know that if he runs against Biden, Biden is so old.
And television host Bill Maher also weighed in this weekend on the same question. He said arresting the former president would be a huge mistake.
I really don't want to give Donald Trump the satisfaction of talking about him. I thought when he was gone, he'd be gone a little bit. But, you know, there is an ex-president out there now who's going to be arrested, possibly. And he is talking about violence in the streets of his supporters if he does. So I don't know. I kind of have to say, or get your opinion on this just one more time. We can be quick about it. But I just would like to go on record of saying I think this is a colossal mistake if they bring these charges. Not this one. You know, I mean, yes, he's done a lot of bad things, and I'm sure he did this. Everything they accuse him of done, he did. But first of all, it's not going to work. It's going to be rocket fuel for his 2024 campaign. And it's just going to look to MAGA Nation like, oh, you know, you tried with Mueller, you tried with Ukraine, you tried with January 6th, now we go to the porn star? Really? You're down to that?
Yeah, I mean, Bill Maher is speaking for a whole lot of people. I think even on the Democratic side of the aisle.
Didn't you watch Biden's speech? Let me fill you in. It turns out that you and I and our democracy are in grave danger. Biden broke the news that the greatest threat to our republic are Trump-supporting Republicans. Before, I just mistakenly thought they were my fellow Americans who happened to think differently than me about some things and vote differently. But when the commander-in-chief told me to think about them as dangerous extremists, I realized I had been thinking about them incorrectly. Now I have a more sensible point of view of just thinking about them as the enemy of the state.
But the mainstream media is currently failing. It is failing you, the public. It is failing its employees. It's failing at its central task. You quoted one example of what journalism was meant to consist of. I would quote another, what George Orwell said. It's out on his statue outside the BBC. Sadly, the employees do not read it every morning before going in. But George Orwell famously said that the job of a journalist was to tell people facts they don't want to hear. The problem we have in our century coming up is that people will be paying for and absorbing only the facts they want to hear. The argument we are making is one of hygiene, basic hygiene in the media, in the mainstream media. I don't want to blow it up. I don't want an end to it or anything like it. I spent a significant amount of my life in the mainstream media. We just want it to be honest. We just want it to be factual. We don't want it to chase its own prejudices. We just want it to speak truth, whatever that is. That's not so radical. Having different opinions is so 20th century. This century, we have different facts, and it's lethal. It's absolutely lethal for the functioning of society. And if you want to see how lethal it is, look at the situation in America, where not just the media, but every institution, the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, the Supreme Court, every institution, you decide whether it's for your side or not. It's disastrous for society, but it starts with the facts. And when the facts go wrong, or you become glib about them, or decide that it's just the facts that will suit your side, or pretend you're playing a game of honesty and are not actually playing a game of honesty, everything else in the society can go to hell.
A society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in. A Greek proverb from a time well before the problems of our modern economies or the study of economics itself is as true today as it was thousands of years ago. But do we really live by this idea? For the first time since the Industrial Revolution, successive generations are not becoming wealthier than their parents. While there have certainly been setbacks and historical outliers from this trend, it has remained true in aggregate for the populations of most developed economies. For a long time, it was simply the expectation that people's children would have a better lifestyle in their adulthood than they did. But today, that really is no longer the expectation. In fact, most young professionals can only aspire to live the lifestyles that their parents did. Younger generations are finding it harder and harder to get reliable jobs, afford comfortable homes, start a family, and save for retirement. This is despite the fact that the world is a much richer place today than it was at any point in the 20th century when baby boomers were busy building their now unassailable fortunes. As we're all familiar with, the past few decades have seen enormous inequality that has steadily risen over the last 40 years, which is why by 2019, the world's richest 26 people owned more wealth than the poorest 50%. But then after COVID, the biggest wealth transfer in history occurred. Now to put into scale how big this wealth transfer truly was, we have to look at the stats. In early 2020, before COVID began, billionaires alone as just people owned 2% of total global wealth. And this is only including publicly available information. But just a year later, and this number was now 3.5%. 1.5% more of the total global wealth has gone to just billionaires alone, all in a single year. And the result of this is ginormous wealth for the top elites and a never-ending hamster wheel for the masses, where you can never control your own money, where you never own anything, where you have no property, land or assets, or even any prospect of owning these things in the future, just continually renting everything with nothing to your name. Because in the last couple years, as wages have stagnated, the cost of everything around you has gone up exponentially. The volume of homes being bought and sold has plummeted. Real estate activity has fallen off a cliff. That's because of higher mortgage interest rates. So if you just think about it, if you own a home right now with a 3% mortgage interest rate, and you don't, in that situation, you're not going to want to sell your home. I mean, why would you? Why would you want to sell your home unless you really have to trade your 3% mortgage interest rate for a 6% rate? It just doesn't make sense. So there are less sellers. And as a buyer, higher interest rates makes your monthly payments ridiculously expensive. So therefore, there are less buyers as well. So the second one, look at the tech industry. So I'm referring more to the mid-size and the smaller tech companies. So you know what these smaller tech companies do. They burn money. The majority of them have net losses. These companies, they promise to make money in the future, but with higher interest rates, their promise of future cash flows is less attractive. That's why tech companies, their stock prices and their valuations have been coming down. They've come off greatly from their peaks. Now moving on to the third sector, I want you to take a look at manufacturing. So manufacturing makes up 11% of the U.S. economy. Production at U.S. factories fell more than expected in March. The Federal Reserve reports that manufacturing output dropped by 0.5% last month. The sector is struggling because higher interest rates reduce demand for goods that are typically bought on credit. There's less demand for these bigger ticket items, and businesses are left holding this excess inventory, and they're placing less orders with the factories. The ISM manufacturing data shows 5 straight months of manufacturing contraction. And take a look at the banking sector. The banks are tightening up. The flow of credit continues to slow down, and this will cause, and it is causing, and it will further cause more drag on the economy. Everything from home loans, auto loans, business loans, you name it. So if you haven't noticed, this is the damage that is being done on interest rate sensitive sectors. So maybe you noticed this in 1 or 2 sectors, but it's pretty bad in multiple sectors. And you can ask a real estate agent, you can ask someone in tech in the Bay Area, you can ask a banker, ask someone in manufacturing, they'll tell you how it is. And those sectors, they get hit harder and they get hit first. And then the damage ripples into the general economy. It takes time for the broader economy to feel the pain because there's a lag effect. So you're going to see unemployment go up. We're at 3.5%. The Federal Reserve is expecting it to increase to 4.5% by the end of the year. That's over 1 million Americans that will be losing their jobs in the next 8 months. You will also see GDP coming down. It already nosedived in Q1, way below expectations. Nobody cared, but they're going to care about it in Q2, which is this quarter. And the Fed, they're expecting the U.S. economy. They expect that the U.S. economy will be in a recession by the end of this year. Okay, so this sounds bad. Then Why did the Federal Reserve decide to damage the economy even more today by raising interest rates? So the answer is because they believe that a recession is better than hyperinflation. We are in a situation where the Federal Reserve is attempting to choose the least bad idea. So, okay, I'm not defending them. The Federal Reserve dragged you and me into this mess. This is them just trying to pull off a soft landing. So it was no surprise that as this great wealth transfer unfolded, the World Economic Forum unveiled their new plan, the Great Reset. Now, for those of you unaware, the World Economic Forum is a priestly caste of people, mixed up of global leaders, royal families, BlackRock, the world's biggest companies, the biggest banks, the biggest pharmaceutical companies, mainstream media outlets, and the top celebrities. Pretty much a culmination of the world's most powerful people. And these are the people who create agendas and policies that are then adopted by organizations such as the UN, World Bank, IMF, and national governments. And this private organization has no democratic vote, and yet it is quite clearly one of the most powerful organizations the world has ever seen, not just affecting the West, but also Russia and China. So when they unveiled their plan for a Great Reset, this marked a new chapter in human history, and the leader of this organization is Klaus Schwab, who claimed the Great Reset would provide a unique window of opportunity to reshape our world.
And I see the need for action. I see the need for a Great Reset.
And one part of this agenda was to make the world greener and more carbon neutral, which sounds great. But what exactly did he mean by this? Well, as you might have noticed, all governments in the West in just the last year have promoted these policies heavily, with the West now being forced to cut their ammonium and nitrogen emissions by 50% alone. However, for many farmers in Europe, their livestock normally produce ammonia in urine and feces, and so farmers all across Europe were recently forced to cut 30% of their livestock, which meant huge swaths of farmers were forced out of business by the government. And yet these same rules never applied for sectors like the airline industry. So suddenly, farmers and workers across Europe protested. But at first, these protests were smeared as just crazy right-wingers. But as this resentment grew and the protests gripped European nations, the government acted harshly, with live rounds being fired upon these protesters. I mean, in the Netherlands, they even changed the law that officers who killed protesters were now immune from manslaughter charges. And whilst the media covered this up, the Dutch government would never receive any backlash, as they were cowing to the World Economic Forum orders, and the working class people in Europe were forced to see their futures destroyed before them, as they were attacked and mocked in the media. And so it was no surprise that around this period, Klaus Schwab, the leader of the World Economic Forum, warned of increasing anger.
We have to prepare for a more angry world.
Because Western governments were now forcing the food supply to run dry, whilst artificially inflating the prices amidst a global food shortage, only deepening the economic crisis that the majority of the West were facing. And in an act of doublethink, something that came straight out of 1984, media outlets like Reuters would then claim that there was no evidence that the Dutch government worked with the World Economic Forum to impose these new laws, which really isn't all that surprising given the World Economic Forum partnered with Reuters for exclusive content distribution, as the World Economic Forum, otherwise known as Big Brother, controls the flow of information. And whilst you might not see the anger in the news, these protests haven't stopped in Europe. I mean, just recently, protests have gripped the country of France, as the President Macron has risen the pension age, meaning it's going to take longer and longer before workers can ever receive a pension. Even though the majority of France hates this idea, this was imposed anyway, as democracy in Western nations is becoming a facade. In fact, democracies aren't even obeying the people anymore. They obey corporate and financial interests rather than the popular vote, the World Economic Forum over the people. And that's why our freedoms are slowly being stripped economically and socially. Because if everyone had social and economic freedom, then the whole system would collapse. And instead of new parties emerging and addressing these protests, you're now seeing the militarization of the police, more surveillance, more distraction. And it's following this agenda that people like Bill Gates are claiming at the World Economic Forum that during our current worst cost of living crisis and the ongoing fuel shortages, Bill thinks that workers should now also be paying carbon taxes, all whilst people like Bill Gates are using the most carbon of all. They'll preach things like private property for the average person will be a bygone relic, all while snapping up record amounts of farmland across the US, following their mantra of you'll own nothing and be happy. And all you're left with is again more distraction, more noise, more misery, more tension and more depression. No more family units, less farms, less freedoms, and no more rights to pursue happiness. And this is just one of the reasons our habitus has been violently shifted towards consumerism and hollow material wealth, because we're being starved of it. And it's the perfect means to keep control in society. But how did things ever get this bad? The 80s and 90s were the good times, and to an extent they continued until recently. But all of the comfort and riches at the top of the social pyramid have made all of men weak. We are the first generation of losers, and now we're starting to see the consequences. Since then, the West's prosperity has only faded, but it's important to note that the good times only came from hard times. World wars, the Great Depression, revolutions. For decades, the world was better off because of these strong men's sacrifices during these hard times. But with the end of the wars, with the end of the hard times, came the rise in consumerism. The 50s and 60s, the golden age period, up until today, where people have all the luxuries they could only dream of before. And for men especially, with the modern world becoming defined by these empty pleasures, where we have every single song, every movie, every experience, and every pixelated woman that you could ever want at your fingertips. But despite all of this, men are unhappier than ever. In fact, 6 million men in the US today have had depressive symptoms in just the last year. And this number is growing at an alarming rate. Often the answer is just through more pills, more therapy, but this just genuinely isn't the solution in a lot of cases. It's just a way of masking up the sick society that's causing these symptoms in the first place. The real problem lies in the lack of purpose for men. All the comforts have taken away the need to strive towards greatness, as comfort is the killer of passion and motivation. The distractions from this decadence are partly to blame, but the decadent, negative habitus is one of the key problems, as this is what's sucking all the life out of us. It's what causes us to be constantly distracted, lethargic, and more nihilistic. With the incentive for greatness fading away, as society slips into more recessions, more wars, and degradation as a result. This is part of Nietzsche's definition of decadence, how it stifles the potential of man. Decadence limits people's actions on the world, and we see this with Patrick Bateman. American Psycho is one of the most important films ever made. Men across the world find themselves identifying with American Psycho unlike any other movie out there. Everywhere you look online, you'll see American Psycho memes, edits, and discussions. And having already made a video on this, I thought I understood why. But 1 year passed and I realized there was so much more to this movie than I ever thought. So after reading through the book and rewatching the movie multiple times, I saw the much deeper layer to this movie. A layer that I hadn't seen anyone tap into. And it's time we understand why this movie so expertly taps into the psyche of men around the world. With his agency being limited with the lifestyle he is chained to, as his life is completely dominated by status and wealth, he sees no value in actual relationships, because that's what the society rewards. He never listens to the people around him, because the people around him don't listen to him, and instead the only thing he cares about is pursuing affairs and other distractions. His life is filled with noise. Even his soon-to-be wife is just another material object, someone to make him fit in.
Because I want to fit in.
But this disregard for human value and community seems like it's now eventually catching up with them. It gets so out of hand that Patrick even invites his secretary to his home and nearly kills her, getting so far as to hold a nail gun to the back of her head. But Patrick's secretary is unlike the other people in his world. In her, Patrick sees some kind of genuine connection. She's a real person. She isn't living this lie. She isn't twisted inside. She hasn't been ground down by the decadence of the society. And this is ultimately what stops him from carrying out his plan to murder her. Instead, he just sends her home unaware of how close to death she really came. Patrick does this because his secretary is representative of the way out of the spiral of decadence. She has virtue, she has morals, she's not chained to the cycle of materialism, and his hesitance shows at least some glimmer of humanity inside of him. However, it seems clear that Patrick is only murdering people that he sees as a problem in society. Prostitutes, bimbos, the other 1%. He despises all of it and wants to destroy it completely. It's all this excessive and absurd violence, the absurd sex, the absurd facial routines, dinner reservations, card comparing lifestyle that is a symptom of his deep-seated repression. Repression coming from the decadent lifestyle breeding these weak, shallow lives. And all this pressure causes Patrick to go completely off the rails. Tortured by his meaningless existence, he lashes out. He breaks up with his girlfriend and then proceeds to go on a rampage, running through the city at night, shooting women, shooting police, being chased by police helicopters. And it's in this moment that Patrick reveals his emotional side. In the first time in the movie, he lets out all his repression. He shows how crazy he's become, how much hatred he has for the society around him, telling his lawyer all of his crimes, as he descends into a full-on mental breakdown, which is symbolic. It perfectly illustrates how the weak men create the bad times. They find themselves unable to impact the world and leads directly to repression. It's like Patrick's living in a dream world, where every time he tries to make something happen, to just have an effect to be felt as a person or to be seen for who he really is, his actions are never really felt. His punches never land. He's just floating through this bubble, filled to the brim with rage, despair, and loneliness without any catharsis. And this is why men relate to the story so much. The feeling of their masculinity seeping away, their passion, purpose, and identity being numb to the drab deluge of meaningless plastic culture. And this cycle just comes up in history time and time again. The clearest example of this was the Western Roman Empire. Drunk on their successes, the empire fell into decadence as the upper senatorial class became out of touch with what was really happening. They spent their days having orgies, eating so much that they were throwing up, and lying around in warm baths. And this weakness was taken advantage of, and Rome's army was slowly replaced by other strong men from non-Roman heritage, the people who had been pillaged by the Romans in the first place, the people who had gone through hard times and created hard men. And so when they decided to take Rome for themselves, there was nobody that could stop them. These weak men at the top of Roman society led to the downfall of their own civilization. Regardless of the time span between us and them, there are still crucial lessons about human nature to be learned, as this cycle has continually repeated itself throughout history. And now we're entering the stage in the cycle where weak men create hard times, and the people at the top are so comfortable, so greedy, and so devoid of transcendental meaning or purpose that they've started hoarding comforts and wealth, which is why materialism in the West has become our new religion, and the absurd decadent lifestyle of the 1%. The people on Wall Street, the leaders, the politicians, the celebrities, inevitably leads to mass repression. And this repression leads to people lashing out, be that through exploiting their power to make other people miserable, or through even more indulgence and excess. All of this compounds to make society devoid of community, transcendental purpose, and a connection to those around you. It shifts the habitus to align with these cold, callous, and apathetic people. And this is what leads to hard times. What happened in Rome is the same as what's happening now. And so as the film ends, you'd expect there to be some sort of repercussions from his massive rampage. But the next day for Patrick Bateman is seemingly exactly the same as the previous one. We see Patrick doing his usual routine, talking to the same people, living the same lies, and then visiting Paul Allen's apartment where he was storing the bodies. But instead of bodies, he finds cleaning and renovating supplies everywhere. Either he hasn't done this, or some company has come to clean up his mess, with a stern woman telling him to leave and not come back. This is the first part of the lack of consequences for Patrick's crimes. Patrick talks to his friends, but they don't think anything's out of the ordinary. They don't care that Patrick is in a full-on breakdown. And neither does his lawyer. He thinks that the confession was just a joke and that Patrick is someone else. So Patrick tries to speak in the most plain terms possible. I killed Paul Allen. And I liked it. But this still doesn't get through. His lawyer doesn't even recognize him and tells Patrick that he had dinner with Paul Allen. It seems like nothing Patrick does has any impact on the world. No one even knows who he is. He doesn't exist, because when no one recognizes him, when no one wants to know the real Patrick Bateman, no one can see anything, and so Patrick doesn't even exist. He has no impact on life whatsoever. And the final scene of the movie shows this, with Patrick's final monologue describing his unsatisfied and unsolved pain, finishing with the line, "His confession has meant nothing." Now, many people see the ending of American Psycho as just a vague message that Patrick hallucinated the murders and the rampage the entire time. But based on what we've already talked about, we can find a different meaning this time. It seems like nothing that Patrick did happened because it doesn't actually matter if it happened. In American Psycho, the world is an ultimate abstraction of decadence and consumerism. And Patrick Bateman is the embodiment of this corrupted society. His values are the society's values and vice versa. He is society. Patrick Bateman is the analogy for our materialistic, decadent world. He lost his agency because he's hopelessly entangled in materialism. He's weak, he's comfortable, he doesn't have fire under him. He's not achieving his purpose because him and his society only value the vapid, not human life, not human spirit, not transcendental meaning. So it doesn't matter in the end. His confession means nothing. But with this blunt ending, there's something we can take away from this. The hard times that we're just about to enter will only be solved by strong men. And the only route to that is through self-improvement. Not the kind of empty, hollow improvement that Bateman engaged in, but instead the kind that helps a man find a purpose in life. The kind that actually helps you build real, meaningful relationships. And the kind that takes you away from the meaningless distractions and ever-increasing decadence you find yourself enveloped in. But until enough men are forced to change our habitus, when hard times descend upon us, will society eventually reflect the better way of being? But for now, it's very clear that the weak men of our generation have created a future of hard times awaiting us.
The way the world thinks of America post 9/11 is so different. There was a window of time right after the attacks on the World Trade Center where the whole world was united with America. And that was squandered for money. That was squandered when we invaded Iraq. That was squandered when, people had this real, true understanding of what the motivations really were, and the fact there weren't really weapons of mass destruction, and that we saw the devastation and the lost lives, and the way the world looks at us is incredibly different. From September 11th, 2001 to today, it's just a complete polar shift.
Countless ups, downs, and countervening directions. History does move in a direction, but I can swear that it's not one that you, or even I, can really understand. One of the modern left's favorite phrases is that they are on the right side of history. However, what if I were to tell you that that wasn't true, that the next 2 decades belong to the very opposite group, the far right? From looking at the patterns in history and trends, I believe that the pendulum will swing back in the other direction for the next few decades. Although I myself am a right-winger, it would be a lie for me to say I'm not terrified for how far the pendulum might go in the other direction.
My goodness, don't you remember when you went first to school? You went to kindergarten. And in kindergarten, the idea was to push along so that you could get into first grade, and then push along so that you could get into second grade, third grade, so on, going up and up. And then you went to high school, and this was a great transition in life. And now the pressure is being put on. You must get ahead. You must go up the grades and finally be good enough to get to college. And then when you get to college, you're still going step by step, up to the great moment in which you're ready to go out into the world. And then when you get out into this famous world comes the struggle for success in profession or business. And again, there seems to be a ladder before you, something for which you're reaching all the time. And then, suddenly, when you're about 40 or 45 years old in the middle of life, you wake up one day and say, huh? I've arrived. And by Jove, I feel pretty much the same as I've always felt. In fact, I'm not so sure that I don't feel a little bit cheated. Because, you see, you were fooled. You were always living for somewhere where you aren't. And while, as I said, it is of tremendous use for us to be able to look ahead in this way and to plan, there is no use planning for a future, which when you get to it and it becomes a present, you won't be there. You'll be living in some other future which hasn't yet arrived. And so in this way, one is never able actually to inherit and enjoy the fruits of one's action.
But you covered a topic that I've heard rumors about for months. First, I heard about it from some of our viewers, actually, and that's about this site called Deagle.com and their forecast for population changes. So they had this thing on their website that basically predicted population levels in virtually every country in the world in 2025. Now, this is no longer on their site. They took it off, and you can find it in the Internet Archive, and I'll try and include a link to it in the description to this video as well. But that's the part that kind of stuck out most to you and that you were addressing in the article in International Man.
Yeah, it's absolutely shocking. They list all the countries of the world and give their current population and current GDP, and then what they project as population and GDP in 2025. They project that the US population falls 50%, 70%, huge number like that. Same with Western Europe, same with Canada, and I think the same with Australia and New Zealand. I can't recall, I'm not looking at it now. But interestingly, it's only the Western world that suffers this huge population drop.
And so you spent a lot of time researching this, trying to understand, really what they were trying to say, what it would take in order to even achieve these population changes. And what were you, I guess, when you kind of dug into it, what did you come up with? Like, how is it even possible that those population changes could occur?
Well, the only thing that makes sense to me is some type of a biological war. And of course, I've said on this podcast and elsewhere in articles I've written in internationalman.com as well, that it seems to me that the US and China are slated for a real war. Not just a little sport war kind that we had with places like Grenada, or for that matter, Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq. Those are kind of sport wars where we're acting as a bully, but China would be hunting big game.
This is a map of the 11-dash line, issued in 1947 by the Republic of China. It went through some political negotiations, and by the time the communist forces took over mainland China, it had been revised into the 9-dash line. Since then, the map has been a source of tension. Beijing claims the demarcation line as its own, covering almost the entire South China Sea and overlapping with the territorial claims of the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam. But this isn't just a local dispute. The US Navy regularly patrols the area and says it wants to maintain the freedom of navigation. China doesn't buy a word of it and is building its military installations in the vicinity. For years on end, that was the stalemate. But relations nosedived when Nancy Pelosi, then Speaker of the House, visited Taiwan in August 2022. As of that moment, China stepped up its belligerence. Its fighter jets have maneuvered provocatively, its warships have been spotted close to US bases, and more recently, Chinese surveillance balloons have been seen flying into US airspace. Diplomacy is now on life support, and legislators from all sides are apprehensive. So much so that in a leaked memo, General Michael Minahan says that open conflict between America and China could happen as early as 2025. So, what's going on here? Because by the looks of it, America and China are sleepwalking into an armed conflict.
In 2025, the Earth may be hit with a solar storm so extreme that it would be harder for us to recover from than the top 10 natural disasters combined. 1859 was the last time that the Earth was hit by a solar superstorm called the Carrington event, and it was so intense that auroras could be seen as far south as Hawaii. Every 11 years, there is a higher amount of sunspots. These spots are caused by a larger concentration of these bands that you see here, which are the sun's magnetic field. And when those bands snap, it produces a solar flare. In 2012, yes, that 2012 where everything was predicted to end, such a solar flare missed us by a mere 9 days. But in 2025, the likelihood of it hitting us is much greater. If it did, it could destroy electrical grids all around the world and render satellites useless. So your cell phone, the internet, and electrical power for things like, electric cars and the majority of the planet's households and cities would cease to work for years to come.